the Kerch Bridge is coming under increased surveillance and I think soon attack by the Ukrainians. As you say, they've taken out some S-400 launchers. That's quite an advanced missile system. There was a rumor this week they'd taken out an S-500 missile system, which we haven't seen used in anger yet. But if that's the case, then the Russians are going to be smarting after that, to tell you the truth. But it looks like the Ukrainians are trying to probe and take out the air defences of the Kerch Bridge area before they take it out with something else. I suspect an ATACMS or two will hit it.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, who spent 36 years in the Royal Navy commanding HMS Gloucester and HMS Fearless. Chris has also been on operational and combat tours of Northern Ireland, the Gulf and the Falklands, and he's now a respected strategic forecaster, commentator, historian and author. Dr. Chris Parry, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Yep. Hi, James.
I wanted to start by getting your assessment on the continued targeting of Russia's Black Sea fleet. In the past few days, Ukraine says it's attacked and destroyed a Russian Kilo-class submarine, the Rostov-on-Don, while it was anchored at a port in Sevastopol in Crimea. How significant is such a strike?
I think what is happening is that Ukraine is exercising what we call in doctrinal terms sea denial. They're severely constricting where the Russians can go from where they can launch their missiles, for example, against land targets in Ukraine. They've certainly been able to deter any sort of amphibious operations by the Russians in the Western Black Sea. And of course, in the early days, you'll remember that the citizens of Odessa could actually see Russian amphibious ships just on the horizon. That's how close they were. And after the Moskva, of course, was hit by the indigenously produced anti-ship missiles, the Neptunes, that rather pushed the Russians back a bit. Then they had their Sea Baby surface drones, which carry up to a ton of explosive now. And they're out hunting Russian ships, both warships and merchant ships. And they've essentially pushed the Russian surface fleet into Novorossiysk, which is well to the east of what they would call the combat zone. And they're making life in Sevastopol in Crimea increasingly untenable. And as you mentioned, they struck and sank the Rostov-on-Don, this Kilo-class submarine. Now, they've already had a go at the Rostov-on-Don before. It had a huge hole in it when it was in dry dock. The Russians have obviously tried to repair it, got it back on the water again, and it's been hit by what I think is an ATACMS missile, one of these advanced American ballistic missiles that can be really accurately targeted by satellite or by drone. So cumulatively, with their anti-ship missiles, the addition of ATACMS, the use of both air and surface drones, they've made life pretty untenable for the Russians in the Black Sea.
I mean, Ukraine targeting the Black Sea Fleet is nothing new, but it does raise the question, why has Russia not been able to better defend it, especially given we're talking about Ukraine here, which is a country without much of a navy at all to speak of?
Yeah, what we have to remember, James, is that, a maritime capability is not just what you can put to sea. It's the sort of air units, aircraft in particular. It's missiles. It's everything you can launch from land, and that's included drones and these surface-based drones as well. What's going to be significant, of course, is when the F-16s arrive, because they can carry a variety of munitions, some of which are fire and forget. Others have to be sort of locked onto by the F-16's radar, then guided to their targets. But that's going to give them a massive uplift in capability to actually drive the Russians even further away. The problem for the Russians, of course, is they can't reinforce their Black Sea fleet from outside because the Montreux Convention in 1930 says you're not allowed to actually pass warships of belligerents through the Dardanelles and up past Istanbul. So they can't actually put more warships in there. And significantly, the Russians just had a big global exercise, and the one fleet that hasn't been able to take part in that out of the Baltic, the Pacific and the Northern Fleet has been the Black Sea Fleet. They've been notable by their absence. The other big success, of course, that the Ukrainians have had is they've been able to open up this protected route for their exports, particularly grain exports on the western side of the Black Sea. And essentially, that goes through territorial waters of Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey. So, NATO countries. Russians would be very unwise to attack shipping in the territorial seas of those countries. And the last bit is heavily mined by the Ukrainians as it approaches the territorial seas of Moldova and goes into Odessa as well. So there's also a very successful story there, and Russian warships aren't able to approach and target that.
And Ukraine has obviously had a lot of success targeting Russian air defences in Crimea. It says only the other day they destroyed 4 Russian S-400 air defence systems. Between the degrading of the Black Sea Fleet and the targeting of Russian air defences in Crimea, how vulnerable is the peninsula, which of course is occupied by Russia, to an attack by Ukraine now?
Yeah, it's very vulnerable, James. The fact of life is that it relies exclusively for its water on water coming down from the Dnieper River. Now, the Ukrainians have cut that off, and almost all the supplies that the Russians want to get into Crimea, they have to either take through the bits they've occupied, the land bridge, as they call it, in the east of Ukraine. That's the Donbass and other regions there, Zaporizhzhia, that sits right on top of Crimea, or they have to take it across the Kerch Bridge. And as you say, the Kerch Bridge is coming under increased surveillance and I think soon attack by the Ukrainians. As you say, they've taken out some S-400 launchers. That's quite an advanced missile system. There was a rumor this week they'd taken out an S-500 missile system, which we haven't seen used in anger yet. But if that's the case, then the Russians are going to be smarting after that, to tell you the truth. But it looks like the Ukrainians are trying to probe and take out the air defences of the Kerch Bridge area before they take it out with something else. I suspect an ATACMS or two will hit it.
And were the Kerch Bridge to be destroyed or rendered effectively useless, how significant a moment would that be? What would that mean both symbolically but also operationally for the Russians?
Yeah, symbolically, obviously, it's going to mean a lot, and the Russians are putting a lot into defending it. What it means is that their logistic chains coming through the occupied oblasts, occupied provinces in the south and east of Ukraine are going to come under absolutely more pressure from long-range strikes from the Ukrainians, both by drone and by these ATACMS missiles, which got a range of between 170, 190 miles, so quite significant. They're ballistic missiles, so very hard to intercept, and got a very good explosive power on the other end, whether it's a single warhead or bomblets that are contained in a multiple warhead.
Let's talk about the F-16s. President Zelensky has confirmed that the first F-16s have now been delivered to Ukraine. How much of a difference do you think they'll make to the wider war?
I think the difference they'll make, they're going to have to be used sparingly. I think if you look at what Ukraine really needs, they probably need about 140, 150 F-16s to make a difference. I think they're going to have to use them sparingly, both to support their existing aircraft, which are mostly MiG-29s, to enable them to survive. You've got advanced avionics, you've got better radar, you've got a whole range of munitions that can go under the wings of the F-16. It's a wonderful aircraft in that respect. It's very high performance. I should think that the Russians will be hunting them from day one with some of their more advanced fighters, to tell you the truth, to try and take them out of the game. But the fact of life is there are thousands of F-16s around the world. One of the attractions of having F-16s is that quite a lot of countries can donate them if they want to. And some of the most advanced variants are more than a match for some of the Russian fighters that we've seen deployed in Ukraine at the moment. So it's going to make a difference. They're going to have to be used sparingly. They're going to have to be protected, but expect to see them probably launching munitions against both land and sea targets over the next few months.
It's interesting you say, Chris, they probably need 140, 150 to make a real difference. I think Zelensky said they need about 130, but certainly a lot more than they'll have to begin with. Is there any prospect of Ukraine ending up with that number in 6 months, a year's time?
Yeah, it's possible. I think we've got to be realistic and say they're going to lose some of them. And of course, as in the Battle of Britain, it's not so much the number of aircraft that you can produce; it's the number of pilots that can actually fly them as well. And I suspect they've probably got more aircraft and pilots that can fly them at the moment, and that's going to be continuing to be the case. So, preserving the aircrew for those aircraft is going to be very important indeed. So, as I said, use them sparingly, use them for high priority and high importance targets. Don't spread them across the battlefield, would be my advice.
And preserving the aircraft themselves, of course, will be a huge thing. Presumably, Russia will be targeting Ukrainian air bases, looking for the F-16s. If you're Ukraine, how can you mitigate that risk?
Well, what you do, I mean, the other thing, James, of course, is we've got sort of maintainers have to be preserved as well. These are new aircraft, although we've seen the Ukrainians are very adaptable and very resourceful. So don't be surprised if you see quite a lot of old kit being strapped onto the F-16s and been made to work as well. So what they'll do is they'll obviously camouflage them. They'll try and reduce the signature. They'll try and stop the Russians being able to track them back to their bases. And when they are in and around their bases, they'll try and disperse them. You won't put them all together in one place. One of the beauties, of course, of the F-35 and previously the Harrier is you could actually put it out in very austere places and it could operate almost from fields. In fact, in the Falklands, the Harrier did operate from fields and was able to do that. So they'll have to disperse them. They'll have to disguise, camouflage them, and be very careful about their physical and electronic signature when they're flying around and returning to base.
There was a very interesting piece in the Times this week by George Grills, the Times defence correspondent. He's just returned from Romania, where he'd visited what will soon be NATO's biggest air base in Europe. What is the significance of NATO expanding that base not far from the border with Russia?
Well, obviously, there are a lot of reasons for being in that part of the world. NATO needs to concentrate there in the same way it needs to concentrate around the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They come under frequent threat from Russia. There's quite a lot of surveillance, a lot of electronic interference, jamming of GPS. Romania and Bulgaria need to be reassured that obviously NATO is looking out for them, and there's no better way of doing that than putting NATO forces in those countries. And that's part of it. Secondly, it enables the basing of aircraft and other air systems that can conduct surveillance of the Ukrainian theatre. And if it all goes wrong around Odessa and the Russians get their way in Moldova, for example, it gives us an excellent opportunity not only to survey the land area, but also the broader Black Sea region into Crimea and places like that. And if obviously the Russians decide to escalate anything, we're prepared. We're operating in the local environment. We're familiar with the territory and the airspace, and we can react accordingly.
What is your take, Chris, on the rate of Russian casualties we're seeing at the moment? There was an intelligence report recently from the British MOD, Ministry of Defence, saying they estimate Russia will have around 1,000 casualties per day throughout the month of August. Is that sustainable?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I was listening to a speech by a Russian general to some staff officers about 3 months ago, and he was asked, are we going to win in Ukraine? And he of course said, yes, we are. And he said, well, what's the plan, General? And the general said, well, we'll just throw corpses at it. And, everybody got up and applauded. I mean, that is the Russian way. They don't actually think of casualties in the same way that we do. And it is extraordinary the extent to which the Russian people can take these casualties without actually saying, well, this is not really in the interest of the motherland that we're losing all these people. I think that to an extent the losses are being disguised in Russia. Quite a lot of the soldiers are coming from, shall we say, the edges of society, particularly from those parts of the Russian Federation that are not very visible. Not many people from St. Petersburg, Moscow, and places like that. What I've heard is, they've suffered up to 800,000 casualties, both killed and severely wounded, which is quite phenomenal when you think about it. That's just under 0.8% of the population, which is pretty unsustainable. But the Russians are in for the long haul. They've got immense financial resources based on their energy sales. They've got the ability now to import weapons from China, Russia, and other friendly countries. And we're seeing quite a lot of arms transfers now. I've even seen Pakistan saying they'll contribute Shahed missiles, ballistic missiles, to Iran. Well, if they give them to Iran, they're going to end up in Russia at some stage. So we've got to understand that in this new world of ours, that a country's capacity is not limited by what itself can produce, either in manpower or in terms of materiel. We have spoken many times, James, on the fact that the world is split into two blocks now: the Eurasian autocrats of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and the maritime democracies, which are predominantly NATO, United States, obviously, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea, and probably India moving towards that in the future. But the fact of life is these two blocks are moving weapons, expertise, intelligence around between each other all the time, depending on where they're focused in the world. So, behind Russia at the moment, you've got China, Iran, and North Korea. And if they can get away with it, they're supplying arms, weapons, expertise, and intelligence all at once.
And just to go back to the point about the Russian casualty rate, I mean, I absolutely hear what you say, Chris. It is historically fact that Russia has long had a different attitude to the sacrificing of human life. But even though at the moment a lot of the troops fighting on the front line in Ukraine for Russia are migrants or convicts, have not had much training, and not, as you say, are people on the fringes of Russian society, surely there is a finite supply of such troops. And is Vladimir Putin prepared to take the political risk of, for example, calling up 18 to 21-year-olds who are doing their national service, who are, if you want, good middle-class Russian boys, the sons of people living in the big cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg? Isn't that the big risk for Putin?
Well, I think that's the dividing line. I mean, as you know, James, I think most of the listeners know that nearly 3 million Russians are abroad at the moment trying to avoid that draft. So quite a lot of people living outside Russia. The problem is, until you actually make people in St. Petersburg and Moscow feel the pain, it's not going to count. The sole criterion in Russia for policy making decisions is regime survival, and they will do anything to survive. I mean, right now, if you're Vladimir Putin, you're saying, look, I've nearly captured 4 Ukrainian provinces here. It's part of Mother Russia again. And, even if I come to terms at the end of this year, which I think is a possibility, we can always wait till next year, and then we'll grab Odessa and Moldova, and we'll have cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea. That's what I wanted to achieve in the first place. In fact, on the first day of the war, the 24th of February 2022, I actually talked to the Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Tony Radican, and I said, you do realise they're not after the whole of Ukraine. They just want the bottom third, because that is the old new Russia under Catherine the Great. And the reason I knew that is because Putin was giving speeches in front of statues of Catherine the Great. And every Russian knew what that meant, even if people in the West didn't pick it up. So it was always the case, I think, that he was wanting to do that. Obviously, decapitate the government in Kiev, and also make it more of a dependent satellite. But in terms of territorial acquisition, he wanted that bottom third.
And just finally, Chris, on the point about mobilisation and manpower, where do you think Ukraine are with that at the moment?
Well, Ukraine is struggling. I mean, they've only got a population of 42 million, which is, about a quarter of that of Russia. And the number of people who can actually fight in the front line is limited. So they're having to, it's very much like the British Army in World War II. You couldn't actually sacrifice vast numbers of troops in battles because we didn't have the demographics for it. It's the same with Ukraine. So Ukraine's trying to use quite a lot of technology, a lot of expertise to try and supplement its meager manpower. At the end of the day, Ukraine is going to have to pick its battles where it commits its manpower. We've seen all through this year the Russians trying to probe to see where they can suck in that manpower and destroy it. That actually hasn't happened because the Ukrainians have been smart. My own instinct is that once this campaigning season is over, I think we're going to see moves from both sides to try and settle something by way of an armistice. I don't think we're ever going to see a complete peace at the moment because both sides' aspirations are still outstanding. There isn't the basis for negotiation on a permanent basis, but I think there'll be some sort of ceasefire armistice by the end of the year. They'll want to draw breath, see what's going on. Russia, frankly, could declare victory now by holding those 4 provinces and Crimea. Oddly enough, I think Crimea is the least tenable of the parts of Ukraine that Russia holds right now. If I'm a betting man, I think the Russians will end up with the 2 eastern provinces, the ones that are most heavily populated by Russians. They could lose the Crimea. But when I talk to Russians, it's almost as if it's over our dead body we're going to lose Crimea. There's something very totemic, very symbolic about holding Crimea. And of course, the sovereign base at Sevastopol. They wouldn't be able to replace Sevastopol overnight if they lost Crimea.
Chris, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline. Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.